Hello, and thank you for joining Vendini's webinar entitled Pricing for Today's Audience. We encourage you to join the conversation and follow us on Twitter at Vendini. We're using the hashtag #PriceToGrow. Also like us on Facebook and connect with us on LinkedIn. Our presenters today are Keith Goldberg, Vice President of Marketing, and Jesse Schmoll, Product Manager at Vendini.
Pricing for today's audience topic, today's audience. So when we first began discussing the topic over the last month, I kept coming back to today's audience and the old adage that to know where you're going, you need to know where you've been. This reminded me actually of a special I watched on the History Channel about the Colosseum in Rome. The program was really interesting. It was all about the logistics of an event, which I actually found really interesting, especially, of course, the ticketing part. The Romans were a class-based system, and the goal was to jam as many patrons into the standing room section as possible, while giving the upper class a private entry and a nice seat. Ticketing was all about the entrance, not so much payment, so they created separate entrances all around the building with very specific ticket count at each door, general admission by section. A technology hurdle was that printing presses weren't around, so they carved wood or stone into little coin-like pieces known as tessera. As live entertainment evolved, the same goals and hurdles existed. They were still operating by section, but we began to get perspective into money-making strategies. Selling tickets for pence was a normal practice, and theater businesses and playhouses began popping up and operating for profit. The Globe Theatre pictured here was built in London in 1500. As I'm sure with other pricing strategies, early on the idea of discounted tickets began to take shape. Half off at intermission, or discounted tickets in the pit or yard where you might be jam-packed with other patrons. These discounts aligned with a new strategy of allowing patrons to go to the theater and place pence in a box for entrance, hence the term box office. Many theaters at this time operated on a first-come, first-served basis, and seat prices were primarily based on comfort level. Once we arrived at the mid-1900s, ticketing options were widely available, and good seats were being defined by location rather than society. We understood the experience was all about the patron and what they wanted, really. Of course, the printing press had been around for a long time by now, and with mail service, theaters were able to gather patron seat requirements well in advance. They'd send patrons a subscription form in the mail months before their first show, better accommodating and ultimately winning over their patrons. So over my time here with Vendini, I've spoke with hundreds of customers about their strategies for going to market. A common topic is always coming up. It's how we can align technology with traditional or classic subscription models, how computers can coexist with the forms that are sent in the mail. These results are interesting. You know, how these classic subscriptions worked is the patron receives a form in the mail from the theater. They mark their seat choices before mailing the form back to the theater. There might be an argument to be made that holding this inventory while waiting on a response might not be the best proactive strategy for growing your patron base. Now we have both. Both is good, it's inclusive, but many organizations I talk with are relying on their traditional subscriptions. This is their bread and butter. I had a customer in Vendini's offices a few years ago, and the conversation turned to pricing strategies. His issue was that his older patron base were coming less and less as they aged, and he needed to attract the newly retired and other younger patron groups. After some digging, we found that subscriptions were his primary source of income, and he was only speaking to that audience using paper forms, neglecting entire patron groups in the process. Many new retirees have been living with a computer-based work calendar for years now, and are more flexible with their time, also more open to buying tickets online. Ultimately, I guess it's important to speak both languages and make sure it's easy for all patron groups. You don't want to alienate people who only buy online. You also don't want to miss out on the advantages technology brings and technology advancement brings. Adapt with the times and speak to today's patrons in the right way. Now, speaking of today's patrons, let's talk more about today's patrons. Today's patron is constantly distracted with data coming in from all sorts. If we were once told that we have 20 seconds to make an impression, we might now have just 4 seconds to make that same impression. Just like branding, whatever you market needs to be targeted and simple. Today's patron is using so much technology. They're familiar with a simple interface. They're familiar with what simple content is. Of course, the In-N-Out Burger idea of simple content is a model for us to strive for, keeping simplicity key. And I think this philosophy should also apply to ticketing strategy. Give less options. Make it simple for patrons to get started. When we're taking series subscriptions and offering a much simpler experience. The primary call to action should be direct. The first thing that you want them to look at is the first thing you want them to click on. Now, we can talk a lot about simple and how to make things simple for people, but to make things simple for different patron groups, we need to know who these groups are and what they're interested in. We have all different kinds of patron groups. We have young people, we have older people, some that go to one show one time, others that come back sporadically, and then also regular subscribers. We need to identify these groups and we need to speak directly to them in the right way. So let's think about that. What patron groups do you target at your venue?